The shadow you can't outrun. Buddha times Jung on your hidden self. Act 1. The question. There is something in you right now that you are refusing to see. A resentment you have renamed as honesty. A cruelty you have filed under discipline. A desire you have quietly assigned to someone else entirely. You know it is there. You have caught glimpses in the disproportionate anger at a stranger, in the thought you would never say out loud, in the version of yourself that surfaces at 2 a.m. when no one is watching. Carl Jung spent 50 years arguing that whatever this is, it is not gone. It is running your life from behind your back. He called it the shadow. And he meant something very specific. Not just your flaws, not just your dark side, but everything about yourself that you have refused to look at, including, and this will matter later, qualities that are genuinely good. 2,500 years before Jung, the Buddha examined nearly the same territory, the forces that drive human behavior below the threshold of awareness, and reached a radically different conclusion about what to do with them. Jung said, integrate your darkness, make it conscious, bring it into the whole of who you are, because what you refuse to own will own you. The Buddha said, see through your darkness. Recognize it as a conditioned process, not a fixed part of you, and release it. Because what you identify with, even to integrate, keeps you trapped. 2 of the most serious people who ever lived. Same darkness, 2 prescriptions. And they are not saying the same thing in different words. They genuinely disagree about what the finish line looks like. In March of 1936, Carl Jung published 12 pages in a Zurich journal that read less like a clinical paper and more like a prophecy. He was looking at Germany, the marching boots, the torchlight rallies, the sudden fervor that had seized an educated, cultured nation, a nation of philosophers and composers, and turned it into something unrecognizable. And Jung did not reach for political analysis. He did not blame economics or resentment or a single demagogue. He reached for mythology. An ancient god has woken up, he wrote. The god was Wotan, Norse deity of storm, frenzy and wandering. And the patient was not a person. The patient was 70 million people. Jung's argument was precise and disturbing. What a people refuse to see in themselves does not disappear. It accumulates, it pressurizes, and eventually it seizes them from outside. Not as a choice, but as possession. In his own formulation, when an inner situation is not made conscious, it happens outside, as fate. CW 9 paragraph 126. That sentence may be the most important thing Jung ever wrote. Not because it explains Germany, though it does, but because it describes a mechanism that operates at every scale of human life, from civilizations to marriages to the quiet war inside a single mind. 3 years after that paper, Europe was at war. 10 years later, Jung would tell the BBC that every German should have seen in Hitler his own shadow, his own worst danger, CW10. Not Hitler as an aberration, Hitler as a mirror. This was not abstract theory. This was not metaphor. This was a diagnostician watching his diagnosis come to life across an entire continent. And what he diagnosed was not politics or ideology. It was the shadow, the refused self, erupting at civilizational scale. But Jung was not only talking about nations. The same mechanism, refuse, accumulate, erupt, operates in the marriage that collapses under 30 years of unspoken resentment, in the career destroyed by the very ambition that built it, in the parent who becomes precisely the person they swore they would never be. Scale changes. The mechanism does not. So if Jung is right, if the darkness you refuse to face does not vanish but accumulates, pressurizes, and eventually seizes you from outside, then the question is not whether you carry a shadow. Everyone carries a shadow. The question is what you do about it. And on that question, two of humanity's deepest traditions diverge. 25 centuries before Jung watched Europe burn, the Buddha sat with his monks in northern India and described forces operating beneath the surface of human awareness with a precision that would have startled any modern psychologist, and that maps, in uncomfortable detail, onto Jung's own observations. He called them kilesas, defilements, not as moral accusations, but as observable forces: greed, hatred, and delusion. Three roots that, left unexamined, generate suffering rippling outward into every relationship, every community, every civilization. AN 3.68. And he describes something that maps even more closely onto Jung's shadow: anusaya, latent tendencies that lie dormant in the mind the way embers lie dormant in ash. AN 7.11. You do not choose them. You may not know they are there, but when conditions align, they ignite. And what you believed was your free decision turns out to be a fire that was always waiting for fuel. The Buddha went further. In one striking teaching, he pointed out that these latent tendencies exist even in a newborn infant lying in its cradle. Before the child can form the thought I, MMN 64. This is not biographical. This is not about your childhood or your parents or your particular trauma. This is structural, built into the architecture of a mind that has not yet seen clearly. Jung saw autonomous forces running beneath awareness. The Buddha saw autonomous forces running beneath awareness. On the diagnosis, they are remarkably close. Both identified something that operates beneath intention, beneath choice, beneath the stories you tell yourself about who you are. Both observed that these forces do not weaken with time. Left unexamined, they strengthen. And both concluded that the consequences extend far beyond the individual into families, communities, civilizations. But on the prescription, what you actually do about it, they part ways. And the parting is not trivial. Jung believed the shadow contains gold, creativity, instinct, realistic perception, vitality, qualities you suppressed along with the darkness because they did not fit the mask you present to the world. Integration means becoming whole, a larger self that holds the light and the dark together without splitting. The Buddha would not have recognized that description. In his framework, kilesas are not buried treasure. They are conditioned reactions arising from a fundamental misidentification. The belief that there is a fixed, permanent self to integrate into in the first place. The path is not to build a bigger container for your darkness. The path is to see so clearly that the container itself becomes transparent. And the darkness, no longer fed by the illusion of ownership, releases on its own a bigger self, or freedom from self-construction altogether. Two radically different visions of what it means to be whole. Two radically different accounts of what darkness is for. That is the disagreement. And it is worth taking seriously because both traditions have spent not decades, but millennia developing rigorous, sophisticated methods for working with exactly the territory you pretend is not there. This video follows both traditions into that territory. What Jung called the shadow, what the Buddha mapped as kilesas, anusaya, and the proliferating mechanism he called papanka. We will follow each tradition into its depths, not to declare a winner, but to understand what each one sees that the other does not, and what each one honestly misses. Because the darkness you cannot outrun is real. The only question is what you do when you finally stop running. Act 2. Jung's answer. Integrate. Jung is often reduced to a handful of concepts: ego, archetype, introvert, and extrovert. But the idea that consumed him most was darker and more personal, and he defined it with a precision that most people who use the word casually have never encountered. The shadow, Jung wrote, is a moral problem that challenges the whole ego personality, for no one can become conscious of the shadow without considerable moral effort. C. W. 9II, paragraph 14. Read that carefully. This is not a metaphor for your dark side. This is not a poetic way of saying everyone has flaws. Jung is saying something harder. The shadow is a moral problem, meaning encountering it is not an intellectual exercise. It costs something. It requires you to look at the parts of yourself that your entire identity has been constructed to avoid, and the cost is not optional. He was blunt about this. Everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is. CW 11, paragraph 131. In other words, the shadow does not weaken through neglect, it grows. The person who insists, "I'm not an angry person," is not someone who has resolved their anger. They are someone whose anger has gone underground, where it operates without supervision. Jung gave this a single, devastating definition. The shadow is the thing a person has no wish to be. C. by W. 16, paragraph 470. Not the thing you are ashamed of. Not the thing you know is wrong with you. The thing you have no wish to be. The self-image you cannot tolerate. The father who cannot admit he is controlling. The generous person who cannot admit they give in order to feel superior. The peacemaker who cannot admit they avoid conflict not from wisdom, but from cowardice. And here is where Jung's prescription diverges from almost every moral and religious tradition that came before him. Most traditions, and most people, intuitively, believe that darkness should be suppressed. Control your anger, discipline your desires, overcome your weakness through willpower or prayer or practice, push it down, and eventually it will die. Jung said this approach is not just ineffective, it is dangerous. If an inferiority is conscious, he wrote, one always has a chance to correct it. But if it is repressed and isolated from consciousness, it never gets corrected and is liable to burst forth suddenly. C. W. 11, paragraph 131. And then, more sharply, mere suppression of the shadow is as little of a remedy as beheading would be for headache. C. W. 11, paragraph 133. Beheading for headache. That image is deliberately absurd, because Jung believed the strategy of suppression is itself absurd. You do not solve a problem by cutting off your awareness of it. You solve it by seeing it clearly enough to relate to it differently. This leads to one of his most counterintuitive claims. Good does not become better by being exaggerated but worse, and a small evil becomes a big one through being disregarded and repressed. C. W. 11, paragraph 286. The person who inflates their goodness while denying their darkness does not become more good. They become dangerous, because the denied darkness does not disappear. It projects. Projection is the mechanism that makes the shadow something more than a personal problem. When shadow material remains unconscious, Jung observed, it appears out there, in other people, in groups, in enemies. C. W. 9II, paragraph 16. The man who cannot face his own dishonesty becomes obsessed with the dishonesty of others. The community that cannot face its own violence finds enemies everywhere who deserve to be punished. The nation that cannot face its own cruelty discovers, with astonishing consistency, that the people it wants to destroy happen to be exactly the people who embody what it cannot tolerate in itself. This is not metaphor. This is mechanism. The same mechanism operating at individual, interpersonal, and civilizational scale. Jung described what it would take to reverse this process, and he did not make it sound easy. If you imagine someone brave enough to withdraw all his projections, he wrote, then you get an individual who is conscious of a pretty thick shadow. Such a man has saddled himself with new problems and conflicts. He has become a serious problem to himself, as he is now unable to say that they do this, or they are wrong, or they must be fought against. He knows that whatever is wrong in the world is in himself, and if he only learns to deal with his own shadow, he has done something real for the world. C. W. 11. Paragraph 140. Whatever is wrong in the world is in himself. That is the cost of withdrawing projections. And Jung believed it was the only honest place to begin. But where did the shadow concept itself come from? Not from clinical observation, or at least not primarily. It came from something far stranger. In 1913, Carl Jung thought he was losing his mind. He had just broken with Freud. The relationship that had defined his career, the older man who had called him his crown prince, the intellectual partnership that had given him standing in the world. The break was bitter and public, and almost immediately afterward, Jung began having visions. He saw Europe flooded with blood, rivers of it rising to the Alps, thousands of drowned bodies. This was 1913, 1 year before the First World War. He did not know whether he was seeing the future or going insane. He suspected the latter. Rather than commit himself to an institution, he did something extraordinary. He sat down, deliberately, with the figures emerging from his unconscious, and he began to write. 6 volumes of private journals, later transcribed into an illuminated manuscript bound in red leather, published only in 2009, 50 years after his death, as the Red Book, or Liber Novus. In its pages, Jung records conversations with figures that appeared unbidden from his psyche. Philemon, a winged old man who taught him things he did not know he knew. Salome, blind, dangerous, seductive. The Red One, a devil who laughed at his seriousness. Elijah, a prophet who spoke in riddles. These were not literary inventions. Jung experienced them as autonomous. They had their own logic, their own demands, their own knowledge, and they terrified him. He wrote later, "The years when I pursued the inner images were the most important time of my life. Everything else is to be derived from this. The shadow concept emerged from this work, not as theory, but as experience." Jung met his own darkness, not as an idea to be analyzed, but as a presence to be encountered. And he concluded that what is true for one mind is true structurally. Every human being carries material that operates autonomously, that resists being seen, and that will not go away because you wish it to. The Red Book was personal, but Jung's most dramatic case study was collective, and we've already seen its opening act. We watched him, in 1936, diagnosing Germany through Wotan. But the story does not end there. 9 years later, in 1945, with the camps liberated and the photographs published and the full scale of what had happened finally visible to the world, Jung wrote an essay called After the Catastrophe, CW10. And a year after that, he went on the BBC's third program and delivered a talk called The Fight with the Shadow. His argument remained consistent and grew more pointed. As early as 1918, he told listeners, he had noticed peculiar disturbances in the unconscious of his German patients. things that could not be explained by personal biography. Something collective was stirring. And what stirred, unrecognized and unintegrated, eventually erupted as history. In Hitler, every German should have seen his own shadow, his own worst danger, CW10. That is not a political statement. It is a psychological one, and it carries an implication that extends far beyond Germany, that the atrocities committed by nations are not aberrations. They are shadow material, refused, accumulated, projected outward at civilizational scale. And here is where the story acquires an irony so precise it reads like a teaching. The man who diagnosed collective shadow projection, who saw it more clearly than perhaps anyone in the 20th century, carried his own. In 1933, Jung accepted the presidency of the International General Medical Society for psychotherapy, an organization being restructured under Nazi influence. In 1934, he published an essay called The State of Psychotherapy Today, CW10, paragraphs 333 to 370, containing passages about the Aryan unconscious and the Jewish psyche that are, by any honest reading, anti-Semitic. He drew distinctions between the supposedly deeper, more creative unconscious of Aryan peoples and the shallower, more reductive psychology appropriate to Jews. He later argued, and defenders have since argued, that his position protected Jewish psychotherapists internationally, that he used his influence to maintain their membership when the German branch would have expelled them. He later consulted with the American OSS during the war, known informally as Agent 488. The biography is complicated, but the text is the text. And scholarly consensus from Andrew Samuels, Deirdre Baer, Aryeh Maidenbaum, and others points to something the text itself suggests, that there was something in Jung's own essentializing thought structure that led him to precisely the kind of group-level shadow projection he spent his career diagnosing in others. This is not offered as cancellation. Jung's intellectual contributions do not evaporate because their author was flawed, but it would be a failure of exactly the principle Jung himself championed to look away from it. The diagnostician of collective shadow carried his own. The man who wrote that everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in conscious life, the blacker and denser it is, carried shadow material that was, for a time, precisely that, unembodied, dense, and operating in plain sight. If anything, this strengthens the theory, not because Jung failed, but because the theory predicts exactly this kind of failure. No one, Jung included, outperforms their own shadow permanently. The work is never finished. The integration is never complete. The shadow is not a problem to be solved. It is a relationship to be maintained. And the moment you believe you have mastered it is the moment it has mastered you. That is Jung's answer. Not perfection, not purity, not victory over darkness, but a relationship with darkness, conscious, ongoing, never concluded. A self made whole, not by eliminating the unwanted parts, but by knowing them, carrying them, choosing what to do with them rather than being chosen. 2,500 years earlier, the Buddha looked at nearly the same territory and proposed something different entirely. ACT 3, Buddha's answer: see through. The Buddha did not use the word shadow. He did not think in archetypes, and he was not, in any sense that would have satisfied Jung, interested in making people whole. But he mapped the same territory, the forces that operate beneath awareness, that drive behavior without permission, that generate suffering at every scale from the individual to the civilizational, with a precision that 25 centuries later still startles. He began with 3 roots, not a list of sins, not a catalogue of moral failings. 3 structural forces that the Buddha identified as the source of every unwholesome action, every pattern of suffering, every cycle that a human being finds themselves trapped in without understanding why. He called them akusala mula, unwholesome roots. Lobha, greed, craving, the pull toward. Dosa, aversion, hatred, the push away from. Moha, delusion, confusion, the failure to see things as they actually are. AN 3.68, MN 9. 3 forces, not 10, not 100, not an elaborate taxonomy. 3. And they are not personality traits. They are not biographical. They do not belong to you any more than gravity belongs to you. They are impersonal processes that arise when conditions are present and cease when conditions change. You did not choose them. You do not own them. But until you see them clearly, they will run your life with the same efficiency that Jung attributed to the shadow. But the Buddha went somewhere Jung did not go. Or rather, somewhere Jung went differently. Jung described the shadow as autonomous. It acts on its own, independent of your intention, beneath the reach of your will. The Buddha described something structurally identical, but gave it a different name and a different ontological status. Anusaya, latent tendencies. The word literally means to lie along with, something that lies dormant alongside mental process, curled inside the mind the way an ember lies inside ash. N 7.11. You cannot see it. You may not know it is there, but it is waiting. And when conditions align, a word, a memory, a feeling, a face, it ignites. What you thought was your considered response turns out to be a fire that was ready before you were. 7 anusayas appear in the canonical texts: sensual desire, resistance, views, doubt, conceit, craving for existence, and ignorance. And the Buddha mapped where they hide with remarkable specificity. The tendency toward craving lies latent in pleasant feeling. The tendency toward aversion lies latent in painful feeling. The tendency toward ignorance lies latent in neutral feeling. SN 36.3. Defilement curled inside feeling tone itself, not in dramatic events, not in childhood trauma, not in particular memories, but in the bare structure of how experience feels before you have even formed a thought about it. And here is the passage that most directly parallels Jung's claim that the shadow is structural, not biographical. In one teaching, the Buddha points out that the tendency towards self-identity view exists even in an infant lying in its cradle. A child who cannot yet form the thought, I, MN 64. The anusaya is there before language, before memory, before biography. It is not personal history. It is the architecture of an unawakened mind. Jung would have recognized this immediately. An autonomous force, operating beneath awareness, present before personal experience could have created it. But he would have named it differently. Archetype, perhaps, or collective unconscious. And he would have drawn a radically different conclusion about what to do with it. Because the Buddha's critical move is not integration, it is recognition. There is a simile in the Vatapama Sutta that captures the difference precisely. MN 7. Imagine a cloth that has been stained, soiled with 16 kinds of impurity. Covetousness, ill will, anger, hostility, denigration, envy, fraud, conceit, arrogance, negligence, and more. A stained cloth, no matter how fine the fabric, will not take dye properly. The colors come out muddy, dull, wrong, but the cloth is not the stain. The fabric is one thing, the impurities are another. And the process is not to integrate the stain into the cloth, to make friends with it, to acknowledge it as part of the weave. The process is to wash it out, not through force, not through suppression, but through seeing clearly what is cloth and what is stain. This distinction is not subtle. It is the hinge on which everything turns. Jung's model assumes the shadow is part of the total psyche. It belongs to you. It is yours. The path to health runs through ownership, claiming what you have rejected, bringing it into the light of consciousness, and integrating it into a larger, more honest self. The Buddha's model begins from a different premise entirely. The mind, in its fundamental nature, is luminous, and it is defiled by incoming defilements. N 1.49 to 52. The Pali word is agantaka, visiting, incoming, adventitious. The defilements are not native to the mind. They are guests, unwanted, persistent, often deeply entrenched guests, but guests, not permanent residents, not structural features, not yours. This is the core disagreement, and it matters. Jung says the shadow is part of who you are, and health means making room for it. The Buddha says the kilesas are not part of who you are. They are conditioned processes that arise from misidentification. And freedom means seeing through them until they lose their grip. But if Buddhism rejects integration, does it fall into the opposite trap? Suppression? Jung would have asked this, and the Buddha answered it directly from his own experience. Before his awakening, the Bodhisattva spent 6 years practicing the most extreme austerities the Indian tradition had to offer. MN 36. He clenched his teeth and pressed his tongue to the roof of his mouth and attempted to restrain his mind by sheer force of will. The result? Sweat poured from his armpits, his body wasted, and no liberation came. He tried to crush darkness through willpower, and darkness did not yield. Then he remembered something. As a child, sitting under a rose apple tree while his father worked, he had spontaneously entered a state of deep ease and clarity, the first jhana, not through force, not through suppression, through a quality of attention that neither grasped nor pushed away. That memory was the turning point. The path does not run through suppression. He had proved that with his own body. And the path does not run through indulgence. That was the palace life he had already abandoned. The path runs between them, through neither the muscle of willpower nor the surrender of giving in, but through seeing clearly. This is the middle way at its most operational. Not a philosophical compromise, but a mode of attention. And in this mode of attention, something specific happens to the kilesas. Not integration, not suppression. The canonical tradition uses the word pahana, abandonment, release. But the mechanics of release deserve precision. You see the defilement arise. You see the conditions that produced it. You see that it is conditioned, impermanent, not self, dependent on causes that are themselves impermanent. And in that seeing, the grip loosens, not because you forced it, not because you befriended it, because when you see a process clearly enough, see that it is a process, not a fixed entity, not you. Identification breaks, and what is not identified with is not fed, and what is not fed does not sustain. There is one more parallel with Jung that needs to be drawn before these two traditions meet face to face. Jung described projection, shadow material, unexamined, appearing out there, in enemies, in strangers, in groups you despise. The Buddha described a mechanism that maps onto this with uncomfortable precision, though it operates at a different level of analysis. He called it papanka, mental proliferation, MN 18. The sequence is compact and devastating. Contact with the world produces feeling. Feeling triggers perception. Perception triggers thought. And thought, left unexamined, prothuium, proliferates. It multiplies, it elaborates, it constructs narratives, assigns blame, builds cases, creates enemies. The Pali is vivid. Proliferated perceptions and notions assail a person. The verb is samudakaranti. They attack, they overwhelm. What began as a moment of bare contact has become, within seconds, a courtroom drama in which you are simultaneously prosecutor, judge, and victim. And the root of this proliferation, the engine that drives it, is a single, almost invisible move. The arising of the thought, I am the thinker, SN 4.14. The reification of self at the center of experience. Once that move is made, once there is an I who has been wronged, an I who must defend, an I whose story must be vindicated, proliferation is inevitable. And proliferation, the Buddha observed, does not stay inside. It generates quarrels, disputes, taking up of rods and swords. MN 18. What began as an inner failure to see clearly ends as violence between people. Jung saw unexamined inner material projecting outward into conflict. The Buddha saw unexamined self-referential thinking proliferating outward into violence. The structural convergence is real. The difference is equally real. Jung's projection involves specific biographical content. Your particular denied traits appearing in your particular enemies. The Buddha's papanka is universal. A mechanism built into the architecture of self-referential consciousness itself, regardless of what specific content fills it. Same darkness reaching outward. Two different accounts of why. Act 4. Where they meet and where they part. So now we can stand both traditions side by side, not as caricatures, not as team jerseys, but as two mature, rigorous systems that have each spent millennia examining the same terrain. And the question becomes precise. Where does the overlap hold, and where does it break? 3 convergences first, because the convergences are real, and dismissing them would be dishonest. The first convergence is structural. Jung's shadow and the Buddha's anusaya operate by the same logic. Dormant, autonomous, activated by conditions rather than choice. Jung described the shadow as possessing a kind of autonomy, an emotional nature, a possessive quality. CW9II, paragraph 15. It does not ask permission. It does not wait for your decision. When conditions arise, a provocation, a fear, a perceived threat, it activates and commandeers behavior before the conscious mind has time to intervene. The Buddha described anusaya in structurally identical terms, latent tendencies that lie along with the mental process, erupting when conditions align. A. N7.11. The infant who carries self-identity view before forming the thought I. M. N64. Craving curled inside pleasant feeling itself. Aversion curled inside painful feeling. Ignorance curled inside neutral feeling. SN36.3. Not waiting for dramatic events, but embedded in the texture of ordinary experience. Both traditions identified forces that are pre-biographical, pre-intentional, and resistant to willpower alone. Jung located them in the personal and collective unconscious. The Buddha located them in the conditioned structure of an unawakened mind. The phenomenology, what it feels like to be seized by something you did not choose, is shared. The ontology, what these forces ultimately are, is not. The second convergence is directional. Both traditions observed that unexamined inner material does not stay inner. It moves outward. It generates conflict between people, between communities, between nations. We have already seen this in parallel. Jung's projection mechanism, shadow material, unintegrated, appearing in the enemy, in the stranger, in the group you cannot tolerate. CW 9 ISI, paragraph 16. And the Buddha's Papanka, self-referential thinking proliferating from bare contact through narrative construction into quarrels, disputes, the taking up of rods and swords, MN 18. The structural convergence is substantive. Both traditions say, the war out there began in here. Both traditions say, if you want to reduce the violence in the world, the first, perhaps the only honest place to begin, is with the material you have not examined in yourself. Jung's version, whatever is wrong in the world is in himself. See 11, paragraph 140. The Buddha's version, the person who has abandoned the three root kilesas harms neither themselves nor others. AN 3.68.6, same direction, same priority. Different theories of what drives the mechanism. The third convergence is phenomenological, and it is also where the divergence begins. Imagine someone who has done the work. In Jung's framework, a person who has integrated the shadow, withdrawn their projections, achieved something approaching individuation. In the Buddha's framework, an arahat, one who has seen through the kilesas, abandoned the fetters, reached liberation. What would these two people look like from the outside? Remarkably similar. Neither is driven by compulsive reactivity. Neither projects their unresolved material onto others. Both meet what arises with a quality of equanimity. Not numbness, not detachment, but the capacity to respond to reality as it is, rather than as their conditioning demands it to be. Both have achieved, in some meaningful sense, freedom from the unconscious forces that govern ordinary human behavior. But what they believe they have achieved is fundamentally different. And this is where the convergence fractures. 3 disagreements, each one genuine, none resolvable by declaring a winner. The first disagreement is about the self that does the work. Jung's entire model requires a robust ego. You need a strong, functional sense of I in order to encounter the shadow, contain it, integrate it, and survive the encounter. Without ego strength, shadow work is not integration. It is disintegration, psychosis, not growth. Jung was explicit about this. The ego must be strong enough to withstand what it finds. The Buddha's path runs in the opposite direction. The very first fetter to be abandoned, Sakkayaditthi, self-identity view, is the conviction that there is a fixed, unified self doing the experiencing. SN 22.89. Integration, from this angle, appears to strengthen precisely the structure that Buddhist practice aims to loosen. Every act of saying, "This shadow is mine, I own it, I integrate it into who I am," reinforces the sense of a solid, owning self, which is, in the Buddha's framework, not the solution. It is the problem. This is not a misunderstanding between the traditions. It is a genuine disagreement about what the therapeutic agent is. Jung, a stronger self. Buddha, seeing through self-construction. The second disagreement is about what the darkness contains. Jung believed the shadow holds gold, not only destructive impulses but creative ones, instincts, vitality, realistic perception, capacities that were suppressed alongside the darkness because they did not fit the persona. CW 9II, paragraph 423. Integration recovers this gold. You become not only more honest, but more alive, more creative, more fully human. The shadow is not waste to be discarded. It is raw material to be reclaimed. The Buddha's framework has no structural equivalent to this claim. Kilesas are conditioned reactions arising from misidentification. They do not contain buried treasure. There is no gold in greed, no hidden vitality in aversion, no creative potential waiting inside delusion. The luminous mind, AN 1.49 to 52, is not revealed by integrating its defilements. It is revealed by recognizing that the defilements were never part of it. The cloth does not become more beautiful by incorporating its stains. It becomes itself, its original nature, when the stains are washed away. Amen 7. This is not a difference of emphasis. It is a difference of diagnosis. Jung says, you threw away something valuable along with the darkness, and you need it back. The Buddha says, what you threw away was never yours to begin with, and the freedom you are looking for is not in recovering it, but in seeing that clearly. The third disagreement is about the finish line. Jung's endpoint is wholeness, the self, capital S, that contains and reconciles all opposites, light and dark, masculine and feminine, conscious and unconscious, held together in what Jung called borrowing from alchemy, the unus mundus, the unified world, the mandala, a bigger container. The Buddha's endpoint is release, nibbana, the extinguishing of the fires of greed, hatred, and delusion. Not a bigger container, but freedom from the need for a container at all. Not a larger self, but the cessation of self-construction. Not wholeness, but unbinding. These are not two descriptions of the same state. A bigger container and no container are genuinely different visions of what liberation means. Jung would have looked at the Arahat and seen someone who had achieved remarkable equanimity, but had perhaps bypassed the full integration of the shadow. The Buddha would have looked at Jung's individuated self and seen someone who had done extraordinary work, but remained, at the deepest level, identified, still constructing, still owning, still building a self, however expanded. Two serious answers, two different questions. Jung asks, how do I become whole? The Buddha asks, how do I become free? And the assumption that these are the same question is precisely where the real disagreement lives. There is a reading, coherent and increasingly popular, that resolves this tension by making the two traditions sequential. The psychologist John Welwood, who coined the term spiritual bypassing, observed that many Western meditators use contemplative practice to avoid dealing with unresolved psychological material. They sit in silence. They cultivate equanimity. They develop genuine insight into impermanence and not self. And underneath, untouched, the childhood wounds remain. The denied anger remains. The shadow remains, unintegrated, now dressed in the language of non-attachment. Welwood was not alone in this observation. Jack Cornfield, himself both a Buddhist teacher and a trained psychologist, has written about returning from years of intensive monastic practice in Southeast Asia and discovering that his emotional life was largely where he had left it. Mark Epstein and Tara Brach have explored similar territory, the intersection where psychological work and contemplative practice either support or undermine each other. The two-stage model these thinkers propose is straightforward. Jungian shadow work, or something like it, as a useful, perhaps necessary preliminary. Deal with the biographical material. Integrate the shadow. Build the ego strength to see clearly without fragmenting. Then, from that foundation, the Buddha's deeper inquiry. Seeing through the very structure of self that integration has strengthened. Not bypassing shadow work, not replacing it, completing it, and then going further. This reading is coherent. It may be practically wise, but it is not neutral. It assumes that Jung's work is preliminary and the Buddha's is final. That integration is a stage on the way to release, a stepping stone rather than a destination. Jung would have rejected this hierarchy. Individuation was not, for him, a warm-up act. It was the work itself, lifelong, never completed, never transcended, and telling Jung that his life's work is a useful prelude to someone else's finish line is not dialogue. It is absorption. The honest position may be simpler and less comfortable. These are different maps drawn for different terrain, and which map you need may depend not on which tradition is ultimately correct, but on where you are lost. Act 5. Close. So we return to where we began. The resentment you renamed as honesty, the cruelty filed under discipline, the desire assigned to someone else entirely. It is still there. It was there before you pressed play on this video, and it will be there after. Neither Jung nor the Buddha promised that the darkness goes away. What they promised, and this is the rare thing they agree on completely, is that refusing to look at it is the worst possible strategy. On that, there is no disagreement at all. But on what looking means, on what you do once you have turned toward what you have been avoiding, two traditions diverge, and the divergence is real. Jung's answer is ownership. The man brave enough to withdraw all his projections knows that whatever is wrong in the world is in himself. See 11, paragraph 140. And that knowledge is not the end of the work. It is the beginning. You take what you have seen. You sit with it. You carry it consciously rather than unconsciously. You do not pretend the anger is gone. You do not pretend the cruelty is someone else's. You do not pretend that desire is beneath you. You hold it. You know it. You choose what to do with it. And the choosing, the conscious choosing, is what Jung called the moral effort that the shadow demands. This is not comfortable. Jung never said it was. What he said is that the alternative, letting the shadow run your life from behind your back, projecting it onto your spouse, your neighbor, your nation's enemies, is worse. Not morally worse in some abstract sense, worse in the concrete, measurable sense that unconscious material does more damage than conscious material. Every time, without exception, own your darkness and you have a problem you can work with. Refuse it and it becomes your fate. The Buddha's answer is clarity. Not ownership, but recognition. Not this is mine, but this is a process. The Bodhisattva tried suppression, clenching his teeth, pressing his tongue to the roof of his mouth, restraining mind with mind, MN 36. Sweat poured from his body. Liberation did not come. He tried indulgence, the palace, the pleasures, the life designed to insulate him from suffering. That did not work either. What worked was neither force nor surrender. What worked was a quality of attention that sees a defilement arise, sees the conditions that produced it, sees that it is impermanent, conditioned, and not self. And in that seeing, the identification breaks. Not because you decided to let go, because there was nothing to hold on to. The grip releases not through effort, but through clarity, as if you had been clenching a fist in the dark and someone turned on the light, and you saw that your hand was empty. This is not passivity. The Buddha's path requires more sustained discipline than almost any psychological framework ever devised. Years, sometimes decades, of training the mind to see what it habitually refuses to see. But the mechanism of release is different from the mechanism of integration. Integration says, bring the darkness into a larger self. Release says, see through the darkness until the self it was attached to becomes transparent. Two prescriptions, both serious, both developed with the kind of rigor that only centuries of sustained practice and observation can produce. And here is what I want to leave you with. Not as resolution, but as an honest reckoning. It would be clean to say that one tradition is right and the other is a useful approximation. It would be clean to say that shadow work is stage 1 and Buddhist insight is stage 2. Or that Buddhism provides the map and Jung provides the practical toolkit for Westerners who need to start somewhere. These readings exist. Some of them are coherent. None of them are neutral. Jung did not spend 50 years developing a preliminary exercise. The Buddha did not teach a more advanced version of Swiss psychotherapy. These are different investigations, conducted with different assumptions, aiming at different endpoints. Wholeness and freedom are not synonyms. A bigger self and no self are not the same destination described in different languages. They are different destinations, and the courage of both traditions lies in taking their own conclusions seriously, even when those conclusions are difficult to reconcile. What they share, and this may be enough, is the insistence that the darkness you refuse to face does not disappear. It accumulates, it pressurizes, it projects, it erupts in your relationships, in your communities, in your history. Whether you call it shadow or kilesa, whether you trace it to the personal unconscious or to the conditioned structure of self-referential consciousness, the operational truth is the same. What you will not look at will run your life, Jung said. Make it yours, and you have a chance. The Buddha said, see through it, and you are free. Perhaps these are two answers to the same question. Perhaps they are answers to different questions entirely, and which one you need depends not on which tradition is ultimately correct, but on where you are standing when the darkness becomes impossible to ignore. The shadow you cannot outrun is real. What you do when you stop running, that is the question both traditions hand back to you.